The crack came so fast I did not see it coming. The butt of my stepfather's gun smashed into my shoulder, and the shock ripped through me like fire, exploding under my skin. My chair skidded back, and the table rattled papers, scattering across the floor. But the sound that filled the room was his roar, low and guttural sign, the deed. Now his spit hit my cheek as his hand raised the weapon again. And for a moment the world tilted my ears, ringing my vision swimming, but I held on, forcing my body not to collapse, forcing myself not to give him the satisfaction of seeing me fall. My mother stood a few feet away, frozen with her hands clenched in front of her chest, her face pale, her lips moving in a whisper. I knew too well. Please just sign, Anna. Just sign and stop this. Her voice not pleading for me, but pleading for him, pleading for the quiet she always chose over me. Jason leaned against the wall, his smirk wide and cruel, his arms folded as if watching me bleed was a show, and his laugh broke through the tension. Do it, he sneered. Do it before he makes you, his tone dripping with triumph. My heart hammered so violently I could feel it in my throat. Fear pounded through me. Every instinct screamed to run or beg or cry, but I had lived too many years with their fists, their gaslighting, their silence, and I knew that if I bent this time, I would never stand again. Mark, the man who called himself my stepfather, pressed the cold barrel against the side of my head, the steel chilling my skin until it burned his eyes dark and flat, his finger flexing against the trigger, and his voice cut the air like a blade you sign or you lose everything, including your life. The air thickened my breath sharp and ragged. The pen lying on the table felt like a noose waiting to tighten. Jason's chuckle scratched against my nerves. My mother's eyes filled with tears she would not shed for me, but only for the man who held the gun. My body trembled with the ache from the blow, blood seeping slowly from a cut at my hairline, dripping warm down the side of my face, and the metallic scent mixed with the acrid stench of alcohol on his breath. But I forced my lips, still, forced my eyes not to close. I let the silence stretch until it was unbearable, until his grip tightened and Jason shifted with restless eagerness, until my mother whispered again, "Just do it, Anna. Just do it and prove you love us." And then, instead of breaking, instead of folding, I raised my chin and let my lips curl into a slow, calm smile. The kind of smile that did not belong in a room with a gun pressed against a woman's temple. The kind of smile that carried defiance instead of fear, and it made him falter. His brows drawing together, confusion flashing like a crack in stone. My voice when it came was quiet, soft, almost casual, like I was discussing dinner and not staring down the barrel of his rage. "Look over there!" I whispered my words, slicing through the silence. And for the first time, the smirk slid off Jason's face as his head jerked in the direction of my gesture. Mark's eyes followed too, a flicker of uncertainty breaking the mask of control. And in that single heartbeat, I knew I had shifted the balance. They believed they had me cornered, broken, outnumbered, but as their gaze slipped away, I smiled wider because what they thought was power was already slipping through their fingers, and for the first time in years, I was not the victim. I was the storm they never saw coming. My name is Anna Thompson, and when that gun pressed against my head, I was 28 years old enough to know better, but still caught in the chains of a family that had been poisoning me since I was a child, and to understand why I sat there bleeding, yet smiling. You need to see what my life looked like before that moment, because it did not begin with a gun. It began with silence, with bruises, with words that cut deeper than fists. Mark had entered my life when I was 10, a man who carried himself with the swagger of a soldier, even though he had never served a day. A man who believed respect was not earned, but demanded. And his voice boomed through every hallway of the house we lived in, his belt hanging heavy at his waist, not as an accessory, but as a warning, because when he snapped it free, it was punishment and control, and every lash was a reminder that I was small, that I was powerless, that in his world I did not belong. My mother, Linda, had once been gentle, or at least I think she had, but when she married Mark, her laughter grew rehearsed. Her eyes grew cautious, and her words shrank until they fit neatly inside whatever script he wanted her to play. She folded herself smaller and smaller each year, as though survival meant siding with him, even if it meant sacrificing me. Then there was Jason Mark's son from another relationship. He came to live with us when I was 12, only a year older than me, but treated like a king, while I was treated like the stain on the family name. If Jason failed a test, it was the teacher's fault. If Jason broke a window, it was because I provoked him. If Jason screamed until his voice cracked, it was excused as youthful energy while I was told to sit still, shut up, and be grateful. The difference in treatment was a canyon that widened each day, and I fell into it over and over until I began to believe I deserved the darkness waiting at the bottom. Dinners at our house were not meals. They were minefields, Mark at the head of the table with his beer. Jason cracking barbed jokes that everyone else pretended were funny. My mother setting down dishes with trembling hands as though food could disguise the rot in our walls, and me shrinking, chewing, quietly smiling just enough so they would not call me ungrateful. When my grandfather George came to visit, the air changed. He was my mother's father, a man with rough hands and tired shoes, who never looked down on me, who would slip me a 20 when I was broke, who listened when I cried without telling me to be quiet, who told me dignity came not from approval, but from truth, and he was the only one who looked at me like I was worth something. With him, I was not a mistake. I was a granddaughter. I was blood, and those afternoons on the porch, sipping bitter coffee while he told me stories about working with his hands, were the only times I felt like life could be bigger than the cage my family built around me. When he died, everything cracked open, the last light in my life extinguished. But then the will was read, and it was as though his ghost had thrown a grenade into the family, because every cent, every acre, every investment he had built quietly over decades was left to me, and only me. The room froze when the lawyer said my name. My stepfather's jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Jason let out a laugh like it was a joke, and my mother whispered there must be a mistake, but there was no mistake. George had chosen me. The invisible one, the scapegoat, the girl they had buried beneath silence. And with that choice, he handed me not only money, but a target painted across my back. From that day on, their cruelty sharpened into something heavier. Mark's eyes followed me with calculation instead of contempt. Jason's jokes grew more venomous, and my mother began parroting Mark's sentences like a recording, repeating that family shares, that keeping it all would be selfish, that a good daughter would know better. Every dinner became a courtroom where I was on trial. Every question about my plans was a trap. Every laugh at my expense was another cut, and yet I sat through it all, nodding, answering lightly, memorizing every flicker in their eyes, because somewhere inside me, the girl who had once begged for love was gone, and in her place was a woman who understood that survival meant preparing, waiting, and striking back when the moment came. So when Mark finally lifted that gun, when Jason smirked and my mother whispered, "Just sign," the truth was that the moment had been building for years, because I had never truly been their daughter, never truly been their sister, never truly been family. I had been prey, and they had mistaken silence for surrender, when in reality it was the silence of someone learning, someone planning, someone ready to smile in the face of a gun. The day the lawyer read my grandfather's will is burned into my memory like fire across paper. It was a morning heavy with grief, and yet the air inside that small office felt colder than any funeral. I sat stiff in a wooden chair, clutching a tissue that had long since grown damp in my hand, and across from me, Mark sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his leg bouncing with restless impatience, while my mother Linda kept her head down as if by avoiding my eyes she could avoid what was about to happen. And Jason leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk, his phone in his hand, his whole body radiating the confidence of someone who had already convinced himself that he was about to win. When the lawyer adjusted his glasses and began reading, the room seemed to shrink around me, his words crisp, his tone formal, and then the sentence fell like a thunderclap. George Miller leaves his entire estate, including the Thompson property and all financial accounts, to his granddaughter, Anna Thompson. For a moment, there was silence, the kind of silence so sharp it feels like sound. Then Jason let out a sharp laugh, a bark of disbelief. "You're kidding," he scoffed. "You're joking." But the lawyer did not laugh. He simply continued reading, his voice steady, his authority unquestioned. My stepfather's jaw clenched so hard, the vein in his temple pulsed, his hand curling into a fist on the table, and my mother finally whispered, "There must be a mistake," her voice trembling, her eyes darting to Mark as though begging him to fix it to take the truth and mold it into something more convenient. But there was no mistake. George had left everything to me. Millions in assets built from decades of small investments land that carried both history and value of fortune. No one in that room had suspected existed in such scale, and the weight of it pressed down on us all, except it pressed differently on each person. For me, it was heavy with responsibility for them. It was heavy with greed. From that day forward, I saw their faces differently. Mark no longer looked at me with simple contempt. Now his gaze was sharpened with calculation, like a predator circling prey. It had underestimated. Jason's smirks turned sharper. His words carried more venom. And Linda? My own mother began echoing Mark's sentences, word for word. Family should share Anna. It is selfish to keep it all, a good daughter knows better, and every repetition was another betrayal, another wound deeper than the bruises of my childhood. They invited me to dinners more often, dinners that were staged like theater food, carefully arranged. Linda smiling too brightly, Jason leaning in with his false charm, Mark sitting in silence that felt louder than any threat, and each meal circled back to the same unspoken demand. What would I do with the inheritance? Would I share? Would I sign something for fairness? And every time I answered lightly, vaguely, buying time, memorizing the shift in their eyes. My stomach churned with dread, after each visit my body buzzing like a cage too small to contain me. I could feel the storm building in the way Mark's hands tightened around his beer, in the way Jason's jokes cut deeper, in the way my mother's eyes slid away whenever I looked at her, and I knew they were circling, closing in, preparing for something bigger than words. The inheritance was no longer money, it was a weapon, and they had chosen their target, and that target was me. At night, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, hearing Mark's voice echoing in my head. Family should share, hearing Jason's sneer, "You do not deserve it," hearing my mother's whisper, "Just sign and prove you love us," and the words twisted inside me like snakes, until I realized the truth. They would never stop asking, never stop pressing, never stop sharpening their cruelty, not until I broke or until I fought back. That realization was not a burst of courage. It was slow, like steel hardening under fire, and every time I walked away from their house, my back stiff, my smile thin, I knew I was walking closer to something inevitable. My grandfather had trusted me with everything because he saw in me not weakness but strength, and I refused to betray that trust. I refused to let Mark's fists, Jason's laughter, and Linda's silence erase the one man who had ever believed in me. The inheritance had made me a target, yes, but it had also given me the one thing they could never take back: proof that I mattered, proof that I was not nothing, and that proof became my shield as I braced for the storm that I knew was coming. After the will was read, the atmosphere of every encounter with my family changed. Dinners became battlegrounds disguised as Sunday gatherings, and each time I walked through the door of that house, the air clung to me with a weight that made my chest tighten, as though I were stepping into a cage that had been waiting all along. Mark would sit at the head of the table as if it were a throne, his silence deliberate, heavy, more violent than any word, a beer in his hand, sweating condensation down his fingers, his eyes fixed on me with a steadiness that was more chilling than rage. Linda. My mother busied herself with platters of food, piling roasted chicken bowls of potatoes, bread warm from the oven as though abundance could patch over the cracks that had split us open. Her smile stretched too tight, her voice pitched too bright, every gesture screaming performance. Jason leaned back in his chair, arms spread wide, smirk in place, tossing barbs disguised as jokes. "So, Anna," he would say, "what are you planning with all that money? Going to buy yourself a new family?" And though his words were meant to sound casual, they landed like stones on my chest, each one a reminder that my presence at that table was no longer about family, but about possession. I would sip water slowly, hold my fork with steady fingers, and answer flatly, "I have not decided yet," and the silence after those words was a knife sharp and ready to cut. Mark would finally break it with his low, measured tone. Family should share, it is the right thing, and Linda would echo quickly, yes, Anna families do not keep secrets. And Jason would laugh, selfish brat, you have always taken more than you deserve. Each meal followed the same pattern, a performance circling the same unspoken demand. Sign, surrender, hand it over. And though I smiled politely, my insides coiled tighter each time. After those evenings, I would return to my apartment with my stomach knotted, my body buzzing as though I had been in a fight I never physically entered, and I would lie awake listening to their voices replay their words, dripping like poison, until I clenched my fists and whispered to myself that I would not fold, not again, not ever. The escalation came in small increments, a slammed door here, a smashed bottle there. Jason shoving me against the kitchen counter one evening when I refused to rise to his bait, his breath hot with rage as he hissed, "You will regret this," and Linda stepping between us, not to protect me, but to hush me. "Anna, please do not provoke him, as though my existence was the provocation." Mark's hand once landed heavy on the table so hard, the dishes rattled his glare, pinning me to my chair, his voice sharp. "You think you are better than us because of that money?" And I felt my jaw clench as I forced the words out. "I think I am not yours to control anymore." The room had gone still. Then the silence dangerous, and I knew the line between intimidation and violence had thinned to nothing. They began inviting me more often, not out of warmth, but out of strategy. Every weekend became another interrogation. Linda's hands trembling as she spooned food onto my plate. Jason sneering with every bite, Mark watching in silence that said everything without a word. It was not just pressure, it was siege. Their cruelty sharpened and rehearsed, and beneath it all was a sense of inevitability, as though they had already decided how it would end, they were just circling until the trap was ready. I felt it in the way my mother's eyes slid away from mine, in the way Jason's laughter grew harsher, in the way Mark's silence pressed harder, and each time I left their house, I knew I was walking closer to an ambush. Yet within me, something else was forming, not just fear, but resolve, because I had lived too many years under their rules and I understood them better than they thought. I recognized the pattern of their control, the script they repeated to keep me small, and I began collecting it, memorizing every glance, every phrase, every shift in tone, like evidence in a case I knew I would one day have to argue for my own survival. Nights became rehearsal lying in the dark, whispering their words to myself until I learned to dismantle them, repeating my grandfather's lessons about dignity, about truth, until they grew louder than Mark's threats in my mind. There were moments when despair almost swallowed me when I thought of simply signing to make it stop to quiet the storm, and then I would picture George's face, the pride in his eyes, and I would feel my spine straighten because surrender would not honor him. Surrender would erase him, and I could not let that happen. The tension reached its peak one night when Jason cornered me in the hallway, his hand slamming against the wall beside my head, his voice low and dangerous. "Just to sign the papers, Anna. Do it for Mom. Do it for peace." And his eyes glittered with the thrill of having me pinned, but I forced my voice steady as I said, "Peace will never come from my silence." He shoved me then, hard enough that my shoulder struck the wall, and Linda appeared just in time to see it. But instead of fury at him, her voice cracked at me. "Why do you push him, Anna? Why do you make this worse?" And the betrayal burned hotter than the bruise. That night, as I drove home with my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles whitened, I realized the truth. They were not waiting for me to fold, they were planning to break me, to corner me, where escape would be impossible, and I knew the storm was not coming. It was already here. The escalation was no longer whispers at the table. It was open aggression. It was threats spoken plainly. It was violence waiting for the right stage. And though fear churned inside me, there was also clarity. Because for the first time, I understood that I was not simply reacting. I was preparing. And the next time they tried to trap me, they would learn that silence does not always mean surrender. Sometimes it means strategy, and I was ready to play the game they thought they had already won. The weekend they invited me to the rental house, I knew something was different. The air itself seemed heavier when I walked through the door. The smile on my mother's face stretched wider than usual. Too bright, too rehearsed, her hands shaking slightly as she pushed a plate of sandwiches toward me, insisting I eat while Mark's silence sat at the head of the table, like an executioner waiting for the blade to fall. Jason leaned back in his chair, his arm draped across it, his smirk already plastered in place as though he had been rehearsing for this moment, and for a while the only sounds were forks scraping plates, glasses being set down, and the dull thud of my heartbeat in my ears. Jason broke the silence first, his tone light, but his eyes sharp, so, "Anna," he said, "going to do something fun with that inheritance. Maybe buy yourself a new family. And though—" He chuckled, the words cut like barbed wire. My mother's gaze fell to her plate. Mark's fingers tightened around his bottle and I sipped my coffee slowly, my hands steady though my stomach twisted. "I have not decided yet," I said flatly, and the silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. "At least you have options," Jason said more than the rest of us, and Mark finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Family should share, it is the right thing." "We will see," I replied, my tone as calm as I could manage, and my mother jumped in quickly, asking about my apartment, my work, anything to shift the subject, but the mood had already shifted. The inheritance sat at the table like an uninvited guest that none of them could ignore. I watched Jason's smile twitch sharp at the edges. I saw Mark's jaw clench. I heard the tremor in my mother's voice, and I knew then that the stage was set. This was not a dinner. This was an ambush. When Jason finally pushed his plate away and said, "Come with us," his tone falsely casual, my stomach knotted, and when Mark's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his shadow stretching long across the table, I knew I was walking into the trap they had been building for months. My mother's lips parted as if to speak, but she closed them again, her silence an admission, and they led me down the hallway into a spare room stripped of warmth, bare walls. No pictures, only a table, 2 chairs, and a neat stack of papers waiting in the center. Jason gestured grandly as if offering me a gift. "This will make everything simpler," he said, his voice dripping false charm, and he slid the papers toward me. Mark stood near the door, arms crossed his body, blocking the only exit, his silence vibrating like a threat in the air, and my mother hovered in the doorway, her eyes wide, her hands wringing against each other, whispering my name softly, as though it would soften the betrayal. I sat down slowly, my pulse thundering in my ears, my hands brushing against the edge of the stack, the words printed neatly across the top, blurring together, but clear enough to pierce me. "I give up all rights to the inheritance." Every page, the same legal language twisting into a death sentence for the future George had entrusted to me. A dry laugh slipped from my throat, hollow, sharp. "Are you serious?" I asked. "You actually expect me to sign this?" And Jason leaned closer, his grin wide. "It is what Grandpa would have wanted, really," I asked. "Did he send you a memo?" And Mark's voice snapped sharp. "Do not be difficult. It is not difficult." I said, "It is ridiculous." And Jason nudged the pen toward me, his eyes glittering. "Let us be adults. We can do this quickly and with dignity." "Dignity," I repeated. My eyebrows raised. "This is daylight robbery dressed up in legal ink." Jason's mask slipped his face, flushing red. "You do not deserve it," he hissed. "Maybe not," I said, "but I am not signing." The words hung in the air heavier than they should have been. Mark's eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening. "You will regret this," he growled, and I met his gaze calmly. "I regret showing up." Jason's chair screeched against the floor as he shoved it back. His smirk gone, his eyes dark, and he grabbed the back of my chair, tilting it sharply so that I clutched the edge, his lips pressed close to my ear. "Sign it or we will make you." My mother flinched in the doorway, but she did not move. Her silence was sharper than any knife, and my pulse thundered as Jason slammed the pen down in front of me. Mark's fist crashed onto the table so hard. The papers fluttered into the air, his roar slicing through the room. "You think you are better than us after everything we gave you, a home, a roof. This is how you repay us." "You gave me nothing but bruises." I snapped, my voice shaking with fury, and his eyes flared with rage, his hand darting to his waistband, pulling free the gun that gleamed under the dim light. Jason shoved me harder, pinning me against the chair, and my mother whispered frantically, "Anna, please, just sign. Do not make this worse." But her words were not for my safety. They were for their convenience, and that betrayal burned hotter than the gun pointed at my chest. Mark stepped forward, the barrel rising slowly until it pressed cold and deliberate against my forehead. His eyes flat, emotionless, his voice calm. Too calm, the calm that comes before destruction. Sign the deed now or else. My chest heaved, my breath shallow. Jason's hand digging into my shoulder, his nails cutting into my skin, and I forced myself to stay still. My lips pressed together, my heart pounding so loud I could hear nothing else. Fear wanted to consume me. Panic clawed at my throat, but I would not give them what they wanted. I would not tremble. I would not beg. Instead, I let my lips curl slowly, deliberately into a smile that felt like fire in my veins, a smile that made Jason freeze and Mark's grip tighten because it was not the smile of surrender. It was the smile of defiance, and in that moment, the balance shifted, though they did not yet know it. The barrel of the gun pressed harder against my forehead, the cold bite of steel burrowing into my skin. Mark's voice, calm and steady as he hissed, "Sign the deed," or else Jason's grip digging into my shoulder until it burned, and my mother's whisper trembling from the doorway, "Anna, please, just do it. Please stop this." But I had already decided there would be no surrender. Not tonight, not ever. And so I tilted my head just slightly, my lips curling into a smile that made both of them falter for a fraction of a second. "Look over there," I whispered, soft but sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence, and their eyes followed the gesture of my hand almost against their will. Jason's smirk slipping. Mark's brow furrowing because in the far corner of the room a tiny red light blinked steadily. Undeniable, unblinking recording every second. Jason's curse tore through the air. First his voice pitching high with panic. "What the hell is that? Is that a camera? Is it recording?" And Mark's face went pale, his grip on the gun tightening, though his hand trembled for the first time. My mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock as though she had truly believed this ambush would remain hidden forever. But her silence now was useless because the evidence was alive, glowing damning. I leaned back slowly, my smile widening. "Say hello," I said softly, "because every word, every threat, every touch of that gun is being recorded." Jason spun toward me, his face twisted in rage and fear. "You cannot do this, you cannot!" But the red light blinked on unfazed, steady, relentless, and his bravado crumbled in front of me. Mark's voice rose louder, breaking, "Who did this? Who set this up?" But I kept my tone calm, controlled, almost mocking. "It is already done. Everything you are, everything you said, it is all on tape." Jason lunged toward the corner, his footsteps pounding, but before he could reach the camera, a deafening bang split the air, Mark's finger pulling the trigger. Smoke curling from the barrel, my ears ringing with the violence of it, and yet I did not fall. No blood spilled, no bullet struck, because the weapon was no longer what he believed it to be. Jason spun around, wild-eyed confusion and terror flashing. "What is wrong with it? What is wrong with the gun?" And Mark pulled the trigger again, another explosion shaking the walls, dust falling from the ceiling, but still nothing, only smoke and noise. My pulse pounded, but I sat unmoving, my smile carved into stone, because I knew the truth. The truth that they were only just realizing the gun had been tampered with, the bullets replaced the power they had clung to, ripped from their hands. Jason's curses turned frantic, his steps stumbling backward, his bravado shattering into fear, and Mark's face twisted from rage into disbelief, sweat beading on his forehead, his knuckles white around the useless weapon. He turned the barrel toward the camera itself, aiming to destroy the proof, and pulled again, but the bang echoed into emptiness, the red light blinking on, unmoved, unbroken, watching like an unblinking eye of judgment. His hands shook now, his voice cracking. "What is this? What did you do?" And I leaned forward, my voice steady. "I planned for this," I said. "You thought you had control, but you never did." Jason backed against the wall, his face pale, his swagger gone, and my mother's voice finally broke. "Stop! Please, stop!" But it was too late. The cracks had split wide open, their power collapsing in front of them. The gun dangled in Mark's trembling hands, a symbol of authority turned hollow, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes, raw and real. The sound of heavy boots thundered down the hallway, then a new force entering the stage, and before Jason could lunge again, the door burst open, two tall men in black stepping inside their presence, solid, commanding, shifting the entire room with nothing more than their stance. "Put it down." One ordered, his voice calm but absolute, and Mark flinched, his hand jerking as though he were a child caught mid-tantrum. "Do not make this worse," the other said, stepping forward slowly, his tone sharp final on the table now. For a moment, Mark looked like he might defy them, his chest heaving, his face red veins bulging at his temple. But the tremor in his hand betrayed him, and finally the gun clattered onto the table, sliding across the papers he had tried to force on me, useless at last. One of the men kicked it out of reach. The other moved swiftly toward Jason, twisting his arm behind his back as Jason howled in panic, his voice high, desperate, the smirk forever gone. Linda cried out, "Wait, please, wait!" But her words fell flat, unheard, irrelevant. Her silence had already chosen her side long ago, and now she was left with nothing. Cuffs snapped around Jason's wrists, cold, final, as he thrashed and screamed. "This is not fair. She does not deserve it. Grandpa did not mean it." But the truth was undeniable, caught on camera, echoed in every word. Mark was shoved into a chair pinned there, his arms wrenched behind him, his glare burning holes into me. "You think this is justice," he spat. "You think this will save you. You ruined this family." But I leaned closer, meeting his fury with calm. "No," I said. "You destroyed it years ago. I just stopped pretending." My mother stepped into the room, finally tears streaking her face, her voice trembling. "Rachel, please, we can fix this. We can handle this privately. You do not have to." But I cut her off sharp. "No, Mom, that is all you ever wanted, to handle it quietly, to sweep it under the rug, to keep me silent while they broke me. Not this time." She dropped her gaze, her hands trembling, her words gone, and the men exchanged a glance. One pulling out his phone, murmuring to Michael, the lawyer who had orchestrated everything, the feed safe, the evidence secured. The little red light still blinked in the corner, steady, unbothered, a witness that would never look away, and for the first time in my life, I felt taller than the man who had once towered over me, freer than the girl who had once begged for love, and stronger than the silence that had once defined me. The courtroom smelled of old wood and stale air, the kind of place where lives were decided with words and gavels instead of fists and guns, and as I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded tightly in my lap, I could feel every eye on me, some filled with curiosity, others with sympathy, but all waiting for the spectacle to unfold. Mark entered first, shackled, his hair combed neatly, his suit pressed as if he believed a clean shirt could erase the footage of him pressing a gun to my head, his face set in the same rigid mask he had worn my whole life. A mask of authority, of control, but his eyes betrayed the cracks, darting quickly, then freezing forward as if pretending not to see me, sitting only a few feet away. Jason followed, his wrists bound, his swagger gone, his face pale, but his mouth still working, muttering under his breath. His voice a low growl no one cared to hear, and behind him came Linda, not in cuffs but pale, trembling, her hands clutching at the strap of her bag, like it was the only thing keeping her standing. When the judge entered the room, stood, and the gavel cracked sharply, calling order, calling judgment, and the district attorney rose. His voice clear and deliberate, laying out the charges, attempted coercion, unlawful imprisonment, threatening with a firearm conspiracy, every word heavy as stone, each one another link in the chain binding them tighter. Then the screen lit up and the footage played, my heart pounding as I watched the scene replay larger than life. Mark's face contorted with rage, Jason's sneer sharp, Linda whispering from the doorway, and me sitting still, the barrel of a gun pressed against my head, my voice calm, my smile deliberate. The jury leaned forward, their faces pale, their mouths tight, watching Mark slam his fist onto the table, watching Jason tilt my chair, watching Linda plead not for my life but for their convenience, and the air in the courtroom thickened with a silence sharper than any cry. The defense tried to argue. They said Mark never intended to kill me. It was intimidation, not a real threat, but the DA cut back sharply. Intent does not erase a weapon pressed against her head. Intent does not erase the click of a trigger. Intent does not erase the trauma carved into her life. And the words landed heavy, undeniable. The footage rolled on, showing the flashes of smoke, the useless bangs, Jason's panic, Linda's gasp, the arrival of the men who restrained them, and the blinking red light that had captured it all steady. Relentless proof that could not be twisted, proof that could not be silenced. When the screen finally went black, the room sat in silence. Every juror staring at Mark, at Jason, at Linda, and for the first time in my life, I saw them small, not towering, not powerful, but small. The verdict did not take long. Guilty, guilty, guilty. And when the judge's gavel cracked down again, it was like thunder. Mark was sentenced first, 10 years behind bars, his face draining of color as the words fell, his lips twitching, his teeth clenched, his eyes darting wildly like a trapped animal, his voice finally breaking as he spat across the courtroom. "You will regret this, Anna. You will regret all of it." But the bailiffs were already pulling him away, his wrists bound, his words empty. Jason's trial came next, his lawyer weak, his excuses thinner than the paper he had tried to shove in front of me. He claimed he was just following Mark's lead, just trying to keep peace, but the footage showed otherwise. His hand shoving me, his voice hissing threats, his smirk as he nudged the pen toward me. And the judge's face did not soften 5 years, aiding and abetting unlawful imprisonment violence. And Jason screamed as they cuffed him again, his voice cracking into panic. "This is not fair. She tricked us. She set us up." But no one listened because the truth had already spoken louder. Linda's turn came last, and she tried to paint herself as helpless, caught between loyalty to her husband and love for her daughter. Her tears flowed, her voice trembled, but the footage betrayed her, the whispers, the silence, the words. "If you love us, you will sign," and the court was not blind. She did not go to prison, but probation was written into her record community service. The weight of judgment etched into her name forever, and when the gavel struck, she reached toward me with trembling hands, her voice a whisper. "Anna, please." But I did not take her hand. I did not answer, and she lowered her eyes to the floor. The justice was not swift. It was painful, but it was real, and as the days of trial blurred into weeks, each testimony, each piece of evidence, each cross-examination built a wall of truth around me. One they could no longer tear down with fists, with silence, with manipulation. When the sentencing ended, when the headlines flashed across the news, stepfather sentenced to 10 years, stepbrother to 5, mother on probation, I stood on the courthouse steps, the cameras flashing, the reporters shouting, and I felt the weight of decades dragging behind me. But underneath it was something else, something clean, something sharp space, the kind of space I had never known, not filled by fear, not filled by their voices, not filled by their demands. Space to imagine something different, something mine. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired, but within that exhaustion was the seed of freedom planted in the soil of justice, watered by truth. And I knew as I walked down those steps that I had not only survived them, I had ended their reign over me, and the echoes of the gavel still rang in my ears as a promise that they would never rise to silence me again. When the trials ended and the headlines faded, I was left with silence, the kind of silence that once suffocated me, but now felt like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. The estate was officially mine. Every acre of land, every dollar my grandfather had built patiently through decades of work. The judge's voice still rang in my ears when he declared me the sole heir, and yet instead of triumph, I felt disoriented as though the ground had shifted beneath me and I was still waiting to find my balance. For years, I had braced myself for them to take everything from Mark's fists, or Jason's laughter, or my mother's silence to strip me down to nothing. and now with them gone behind bars or bound by probation, I found myself wandering my small apartment, touching the walls, staring at the ceiling, wondering what freedom was supposed to feel like. Slowly, I began to build a life, not the one they had forced on me, but one of my own choosing. I moved out of the city into a modest house with wide windows and a quiet street. The kind of place where neighbors waved and children rode bikes until dusk, where ordinary moments became extraordinary because they were safe, because they were mine. And for the first time in my life, I could eat dinner without the weight of silence pressing on my shoulders. But I did not forget I carried my grandfather's lessons with me. I invested carefully, quietly, following the wisdom he had whispered on the porch. Dignity comes from truth, and with every signature I honored him. With every decision I chose not greed, but steadiness. I created a trust in his name, the George Foundation dedicated to children growing up in homes like mine. Children who needed proof that someone believed in them, and the first time I signed those papers, I felt his presence steady and proud, as though he had passed to me not just wealth, but a mission. Healing was not quick. The nightmares came often, sharp and heavy nights where I woke drenched in sweat, the phantom press of a gun against my head, the echo of Jason's laughter, my mother's whisper. If you love us, you will sign. But each morning I rose, poured my coffee, and said out loud, "You survived," and slowly the bruises faded, the fear softened, and in its place came something I never thought I would know, peace. Years passed, and with them came more than healing, they brought love. Michael, the lawyer who had believed in me when no one else did, who had helped orchestrate the plan that saved me, stood by my side, and over time, friendship deepened into something stronger, something steadier. Until one day I realized I was not afraid to love anymore, not afraid to trust, and when we married, it was not a grand affair, but a quiet one. Vows spoken with sincerity, promises built on truth. And in that moment, I felt the cycle of pain breaking. When our daughter was born tiny and fragile in my arms, I swore she would never know what it felt like to be unwanted, never know the weight of a house filled with gaslighting and violence. The cycle ended with me, and as she grew, as her laughter filled our home, I found myself weeping at the sound of it. Tears not of sorrow, but of gratitude, because this was what freedom looked like. This was what justice felt like. I did not hoard all of what I had been given. I helped Jason's younger half-sister, the one who had nothing to do with his cruelty, get through college because I knew what it meant to be trapped in the shadow of someone else's violence. I funded shelters, supported scholarships, made sure the money rippled outward instead of rotting in greed, and with each act I felt lighter, freer, as though I were finally repaying the kindness my grandfather had shown me. Sometimes I still saw their faces in my mind, Mark's fury red and trembling, Jason's smirk twisting into panic, my mother's hollow eyes whispering, "Sign if you love us." But those memories no longer bound me. They were scars, reminders, warnings, and I carried them not as chains, but as proof that I had survived. Justice was not just their punishment. Justice was my ability to live without them, to build something better, to laugh freely, to love openly, to raise my child in a home where silence was not weapon, but peace. When people asked about my past, I told them pieces, but I did not linger. I refused to let Mark's rage or Jason's cruelty or Linda's silence define me. I let my daughter's laughter define me. I let the quiet strength of my marriage define me. I let the echo of my grandfather's voice define me, because in the end, it was not money that saved me. It was courage. It was the decision to smile in the face of fear, to fight back with truth, to stand when they wanted me broken. And now, every morning, when I open the windows of my home and sunlight spills across the floor, I whisper to myself, "You are free, and freedom is the justice that no court, no gavel, no sentence could ever truly give. It is the justice I claimed for myself, the justice I will never let go."